You're listening to Authentic Leadership, a series of conversations, insights and inspirations with leaders who are real, raw and authentic. Today, I bring you a conversation with a difference. It's with me. Over the past few months, I've been approached by listeners with the odd question, and so the idea emerged to answer them in a podcast. I approached the wonderful Trent Rosen, Learning and Development Manager of Canteen Australia, and asked if he would interview me because he knew me a little from work we had done together pre-COVID, but he didn't know me too well. Well, it certainly was an experience, and I've developed even more admiration of and empathy for my podcast guests, as committing to the essence of being real, raw and authentic can also be a place of vulnerability. I'd like to thank all those people who I also invited to ask questions. There are no show notes for this episode. I think that would be a little self-indulgent, but if you'd like to find out a little more about me and what I do outside of podcasting, this episode is here for you. Thank you and enjoy.
Claire, you're approaching the end of season 2 of Authentic Leadership, which is a fantastic achievement. So a huge congratulations to you. And you've decided to finish the year by asking your listeners to put forward questions to learn a bit more about yourself, which I think is wonderful. So for the listeners, there are no out of bounds questions. Claire has no control over the order of the questions. And they will be covering everything from work, a bit about personal life and everything in between. And in fact, we've got a little bit of fun at the end called the quick fire. She has, of course, promised to be real, raw and authentic, which we would expect nothing less from Claire. Claire, welcome to your podcast.
Thank you, Trent. I'm not quite sure what I've let myself in for here, but let's just run with it. Let's just go with the flow.
Oh, look, I think it's going to be a wonderful next sort of 45 minutes to an hour of some very raw, authentic conversation. So, look, I thought we could start, Claire, if it's okay with you, just to sort of, before we start introducing some of these questions that your listeners have put forward over the past sort of 12 months, thought it might be worthwhile just taking a little brief walk down memory lane, if that's okay.
Oh, yes.
So you started working in hospitality for a European hotel group and then decided to transition into the corporate industry where you held numerous senior management positions. Then, somewhere in this time period, you discovered you had a fascination with the brain, which then led you to be involved in the first cohort globally of an advanced diploma in the neuroscience of leadership. Do you recall where this fascination derived from?
Wow, this is great because this is not one of the questions we prepared. Yes, I do, interestingly enough. So I started studying the neuroscience of leadership and change back in 2013 with a company called Neurocapability up in Brisbane in Australia. And when we started off with anatomy, so it's not the whole of neuroscience, it's the elements of what they call social cognitive neuroscience that's related to leadership and change. And we were studying anatomy, and I remember I was back in school. I used to in my old Catholic convent school, and I was up in one of the old houses, and we were studying the brain in biology. And I had that same feeling, that same fascination, that just total desire to learn. And so I devoured this course. You know, there's sometimes courses where I've got a race to catch up on things, but not this one. So as soon as I started learning something, I started using it. And I ended up actually rebranding my company name. So I used to be called ChangeWorks in People Development, and now I'm BrainSmart People Development. So that's where it started. It went right back to school, and I think biology and French were my favourite topics. So that's where it came from. Thank you for that question, which wasn't planned.
It wasn't planned. It's interesting though. I think it gives a real sense of the individual where did they naturally gravitate towards a passion or a desire to
Yeah,
learn more. So
yeah.
look, for those that don't know, you are an accomplished speaker, and I can certainly attest to this as I've seen you on numerous occasions. You're a blogger, you're a podcast host, and you provide professional development programs and workshops, which fall under what you call the four pillars. So, work smarter, lead better, build great teams, and thrive in change. What can you share with the listeners on how you navigated your own personal journey to arrive where you are now? I guess to create these development programs.
Oh gosh, yeah. I'm not sure how far back I go, but it is a bit of a story that to make sense of all this. So if say if I go back to I used to work for a US telecoms company. It was an internet service provider. And Trent, I had the job of my dreams. So I was head of corporate development. And this was for the UK and Europe. And probably the last role that I had in that was partnering with the director of finance to do cultural due diligence. So we were looking at acquiring subsidiaries throughout Europe. And we would fly to these offices of the companies that we were looking to acquire. And then I would just very quietly, because I speak a few languages, I'd listen in to how they talk about us and how they sort of talked with each other. And actually one of the acquisitions didn't go ahead because we knew it wouldn't be a good cultural fit. And if you want to know more about culture, Michael Henderson was the last podcast guest and he was absolutely brilliant. But anyway, to bring things to a head, I was part of that internet boom and bust. So I went from having my dream job with putting as much money as I could into the company shares, for them just completely crashing, um, being wiped off the NASDAQ. My role disappeared. And so I was asked to run the call center in the UK. So I took over the call center. We had 120 people, and oh my God, these people were absolutely amazing. And I'd been running it less than 6 months when I was told that I'd have to make probably up to 70 of them redundant.
Right.
So that was the start of the process, really. We went through all the consultations, we went through all the voluntary redundancies. But the real pain came when it was the forced redundancies, because we were a close knit tribe. And I remember one night, my niece was visiting. Actually, my niece was visiting from Liverpool. That's right. And she'd just finished her year 10 exams, and I was sort of coaching her as to what's going to happen for her future. And I just remember sitting on my back deck and thinking, what what do I want? What's been my lesson from this whole redundancy program? And then I just had a bit of an aha moment because I'd been coaching these people to see that there was light at the end of the tunnel because they were so close in their own teams and had so much promise, but they couldn't see beyond life at XO. And funnily enough, now my keynotes are all about shining a light or light at the end of the tunnel. And that was when I went and approached my boss, who was the president, and said, I'd like to be included in the redundancy. And he said, no, no, no. He
Right.
said, you're all right. The executive leadership team is, none of you are going to be impacted. I said, no, you're not hearing. I want to be, it's time for me to move on. And that's when I made the break from corporate. And it certainly wasn't an easy transition. It was a bit of a bumpy road. The day that I was planning to launch my company, Amovita, was actually the day of Mum's funeral.
Oh, okay.
So I ended up, but it all panned out beautifully. I ended up working for a great team development company, and that's how I got into a lot of team development, and team building stuff. and the rest, they say, is history.
Indeed. And BrainSmart, that's been your business now for how many years?
So I rebranded from Changeworks to BrainSmart in 2015 after I had finished studying the neuro leadership. But I became self-employed so after working for the team development companies. I then met a bloke from a place called Maroochydore on the Sunshine Coast. I was at a music festival in the UK, met him, and that's how I ended up coming to Australia. And that's when I started Changeworks in 2005, and rebranded in 2015. So, yeah, I've been going, 17 years?
Right.
Yeah, with what I love to do.
And still learning, no doubt.
Oh my God, on a daily basis. It's my addiction.
What would you say to any of your listeners who are considering maybe going down a similar pathway to you, or maybe already on that journey now? Anything that you'd share with them, like some tips or maybe just some quick lessons that you've taken away from your experience?
That's a great question. From my experience, I would say, gosh, you've got that saying, take the leap and the bridge appears. Well, I
Mm,
think you need to have some sort of stability and security and a little bit of money behind you if you want to do that. Look, for some people, it's great and it magically takes off, and for others, it's a long bumpy road. But I have this saying that, often I feel like I'm dancing a fine line between persistence and stupidity, that never quite knowing which side I'm on. But I would never go back. I would, I learned so much in my time in corporate. I loved my time in corporate, but I've found my niche, and it's the difference that I can make with the experience and the expertise and the knowledge that I have that gets me jumping out of bed every morning. So in terms of tips, I'd say, never ever give up on following your passion, but have a little pragmatism as well, because I've seen so many people who around the same time as me went into this self-employed, and just couldn't sustain it. uh,
mm.
and I've learned to, I this is raw authentic. I've had times where I've had very, very little in the bank, and other times where I've been blessed. But the times when I've had little in the bank, I've cut my cloth according to its width. So no, I wouldn't change anything.
Wonderful. Just on that theme of some of these workshops that you continue to deliver, a question from one of your listeners asks, what's one thing you would hope people would walk away with having taken part in one of your workshops?
Oh boy. Can I have two?
It's your podcast, Claire.
I suppose the first thing is, I want them to have like a really immersive and engaging experience. There's actually, Stella Collins. So I went back to the UK for a couple of years in 2015, and I became accredited in something called brain friendly learning, or how to be a brain friendly trainer. And that was with Stella Collins, who is actually one of my past podcast guests. And she really, with her knowledge of neuroscience, really took us into paring everything back and understanding, actually sort of jumping into the brain of the learner. So, what to do, what not to do to make a learning experience complete, completely engaging. And also, I think, and this is the most important thing, is to be able to go back into the workplace and have the motivation and the drive to implement what you've learned. I mean, you're in the field of learning and development, Trent. When we facilitate a workshop, the feedback forms that you get on the day, they're great ego boosters, the happy
Mm.
sheets. But if you're worth your salt as a facilitator, a trainer, a speaker, it's what people are doing 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months after that's making the difference. And I think so. If I come to the second point, I want people to walk away with the belief and the confidence to know that they've got the resources to achieve what they want, or to make the change, or to build their resilience. And I've just been, you know, the deliverer of the toolkit, the little manual for the mind, so to speak. I think they would be my two biggest ones.
And I'd probably add in there too, particularly in a corporate environment, is that the nature of having a supportive manager, or at least in a team where you can experiment and you can apply some of these wonderful learnings that have been gained from attending your workshops.
Yeah, and actually, that's such an important point. And also, because because I use neuroscience as the foundation, it's not the be all and end all, but I use it as the foundation of my programs. Then it has to be a manager who's willing to take a bit of a leap of faith
Yes.
in what we do, because it's, and I understand when you're in the position of choosing someone to run professional development programs, the choice is huge. And learning and development managers and people and culture heads are so busy that it probably would be easier sometimes to go with an incumbent provider, or an element, or a theme, or a topic that you're familiar with. So this is a shout out to the people that have put their faith in me, to say thank you to them, to go with something that is, I mean, we say new, but it's been around for 20 years. That's probably still a little bit new.
Yeah. It's the language, I think, too, Claire. It comes, that can also sometimes be a slight barrier for some, because it's, what is all this about? How do I make sense of this? I'm
Yeah,
running an operational team here. I don't know if I've got time to really even consider this workshop or these development programs.
yeah.
So I'd imagine you'd have some fairly productive and somewhat challenging conversations with some of your clients, or some businesses.
Very much so. I think, and yeah, it's interesting what you say about language, because I'm really quite passionate about trying to understand what are the outcomes. I know what you want. I know some of the drivers. I know some of the content that you want, but what do you want people to be doing, feeling, seeing, hearing differently as a
Mm.
result of the investment in time? Um, and often that's it can be a bit of a negotiation, a bit of a compromise sometimes, because there's sometimes a mismatch between the outcomes that people want and the amount of time they can invest in developing their people. And actually, this is what I love now. I was working with a client last week, and we're to-ing and fro-ing, and it's co-creation. Again, another podcast guest, Lisa, on human-centered design. So it's about, okay, the first step in human-centered design is empathy. How do I get into the shoes of, firstly, the person who's buying my services, and secondly, the people who I'm going to be working with in the programs, and understand their pains, um, and try and work to the resources that they have, primarily financial and time, and still deliver something that's of quality and lasting, rather than ticking a box to say a program's been done. That I can't do that.
Yeah, as we both are aware, that to be able to thrive in change, there's a certainly, and everyone's different. There's this time period where individuals need to be allowed to make some changes in their own behaviours within the workplace, but also,
Yeah,
as going back to that, having, and I'll loosely use the term psychological safety, but to say, yes, experiment, try, let's all do this as a team together. And there needs to be that senior management support. I've found, certainly my experience is that without that, it's a really tough road to walk.
hugely. And on that point is, again, if a client is only engaging me for half a day, I don't know, a day, whatever, the conversation is also about, so how are we going to maintain momentum, whether I
Yeah.
stay involved or not. But
Yes.
because it's God, you can't learn to play the saxophone by listening to a CD of Kenny G or whatever. I mean, it's practice, 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 repetition. That's how the brain learns. um, and that's what sometimes makes me feel a bit sad, is to follow up, and it was such a great workshop, but we were so busy when we got back into the workplace, that and that's my job, is to try and help hold them to account and set the scene and the environment, including that supportive manager, to say exactly that. Let people have a go, let them experiment, let them fail fast, fail forward. And catch them doing things well, catch them doing something right, catch them telling the new story, catch them embracing change, and acknowledge and reward them for that. Because again, that's how our brains work, is that tiny little hit of dopamine when they get some positive feedback is going to make them want to repeat whatever the new behavior is.
Absolutely. And speaking of, I guess, stories, this leads us down to where you are now with this Raw Authentic Leadership podcast. One of your listeners would like to know, what made you want to start a podcast and why on the theme of leadership?
If I can be colloquial, I'm a nosy bugger. I am just so.
Curious.
I'm curious. Yeah, I don't know if we need to edit that out. A beggar. I said beggar. You misheard. Yeah, I just love people, and I'm so curious. And yeah, why did I want to start a podcast? And it's just something that I have wanted to do. Well, gosh, it's been 2 years now, so it must have been about 3 years ago. And I'm a member of a mastermind group, so there's 5 peers. We all work in different areas, but we sort of hold each other to account. And they got sick of me saying, "I'd really love to start a podcast," and they said, "Right, when are you going to start it? Just do it."
Yeah.
And on the theme of leadership, I think my own leadership journey, I suppose, brilliant leaders who I've just had the privilege to work for. I've had not so brilliant leaders who I've, equally learnt a lot from, certainly in not what to do. And my own leadership journey, and how things changed for me, how I changed my way of leading people. And I thought, I want to give something that's free, that's not available in your well, I don't do 1-day leadership programs, but in your leadership development programs. But and that's why the Raw Authentic, I just wanted to engage with people who were willing to tell tales from the trenches, to share their stuff ups and lessons learned, to be generous with their advice and their tips. And honestly, Trent, I mean this 100% genuinely. Every single guest that I've had to date on this podcast has done that, has been so generous and so willing to share. And I just think, emerging leaders, leadership is also self-leadership. Whatever we can do to help lift people up, because it's not an easy game, and it never will be. And every little bit of feedback that I get from listeners to say, "I needed to hear that yesterday," or "that was just the right bit of advice," that's what makes my heart sing.
Yeah, wonderful. And do you recall who you interviewed for episode 1? That's
Oh
putting you on the
yes.
spot a bit there. Do you know who that was?
Oh yes. No, I'll never forget. I actually set the bar high to start with. So this was a man who I'd sort of been stalking on LinkedIn a little bit, because I loved his posts. And his name's Andy Holmes. and he was head of wellbeing for RB, or Reckitt Benckiser, a huge company. And it was his views on perspective, and it was the connected leader. And the sound quality is rubbish, and it was a real homemade jobby, but we went straight into a depth of conversation that's what got me addicted. And Andy's now since left RB and is as head of sort of the wellbeing practice for Corn Ferry. And if you can put up with crappy sound, I'd really encourage people to listen to it. I'm so grateful to Andy for giving me that first opportunity. It was brilliant.
I will certainly be going back into your archive to listen to that one. So thank you. I've just written that down for myself. One of your other listeners is asking, what's your favourite learning about leadership that you've discovered from one of your previous podcast guests?
Oh, that's like asking who's your favourite child. Oh,
right.
Come on. Okay, so Andy, something that stuck with me, Andy, it was really, really simple. But he said he never opens his email before he's had a conversation with someone. Now, whether that be someone in his team or connecting with a partner, a client, or someone. And I thought that, because quite often we just fall into this habit of opening up email and then just, helping everybody else achieve their objectives. The storytelling, I think the stories that I've had two podcast guests who were both in the military. Will Martin was in the Australian Navy for 34 years. And Bill Sullivan, Sully Sullivan, he did, I think, 4 combat tours of the Middle East. He was a search and rescue helicopter pilot. And I learned something about leadership in the military, that it's not command and control. It's actually very, very equitable. Yes, when it's like situational leadership, when there absolutely has to be those hard decisions. But from both of them, I learned an awful lot about, empathic leadership. Leaders in the military care so deeply about their people. And then I want to go through them all, but I can't.
Well, we've only got an hour, and we've got more questions.
Just one more, because it's recent. Comes to mind, Daniel Flynn. So he's the founder of Thank You, and I think he, for me, was the epitome of raw authenticity. Oh, and then no, I won't go into the others.
Just for your listeners' purposes, what is Thank You?
So Thank You is it's a consumer, a fast consumer good. It's products that are all like hand wash and toiletry products. They started off in water. They went off into baby goods and lots of different areas. But what I loved about Daniel, he was so raw and open, not just with me in the podcast, but if you go onto their website, the reasons they give for closing down products or stopping certain strategies, he tells it warts and all. He's not. They don't have shareholders. They're owned by a sort of a trust, charitable trust, and 100% of their profits go to projects, overseas projects, and they want to end poverty. They've got a massive vision. And so, look, they're 3 I can think of, but they're not my favourite babies.
We've got another question here from your listener. As someone who specialises in resilience and change, what are some life experiences you draw on to get your message across?
Okay. How far back do I go? Okay. So I will go back, because they're called SEE, significant emotional events. So look, I grew up the youngest of five, in a family in Liverpool. Up until I was 16, life was, very stable. And then suddenly my parents split. It was the summer where I decided to leave school in year 10 because I didn't think I was clever enough. Thank you, Sister Mary Gabriel. And I was going to the equivalent of TAFE, to catering college. And I met someone and fell madly in love, was completely infatuated. And that person ended up being an abuser. So I was in a very vulnerable position because mum and dad had split and I was the only one living back at home. And as bullies do, they sort of isolate you from your loved ones. So they'll ridicule family and friends, and you become sort of dependent on them. So I didn't have any. I sort of lost all my school friends, and anyway, so I experienced, as I say, all five forms of abuse. And something that I did was I got away. I fled. I got a job with a friend in a little hotel in the Netherlands. Cleaning toilets, washing dishes. Oh, by the way, she dropped out 2 weeks before we were due to go. But in hindsight, that was a fabulous gift in the challenge because I learned Dutch. So I learned to speak Dutch, came back to the UK, carried on in hotels for a little while, spent some time in Switzerland. And then that was how I went into the corporate world. I saw this big advert for a McGraw Hill company that said, "Do you speak Dutch?" And I went, "Right, that's my job. That's my job." And it was
Wow.
it was telemarketing. So I went from being a front of house manager for a hotel chain to selling strategic IT information services to the Netherlands and Eastern Europe. Talk about fake it till you make it. And so, in terms of resilience, other little experiences like my little studio flat going on fire and losing everything and being mugged at knife point in Madrid, and also, if I am going to be authentic, I was one of five kids. I always wanted a lot of kids. I think that early life experience made me a little bit more than a little bit wary. I had massive defense walls around me. And so I didn't meet Jason until I was 40. And we had multiple attempts, IVF attempts to have kids. And I think I've mentioned this briefly in podcasts before, that one of the things that I learned in resilience was how to look for the gift in the challenge. And so,
Right.
If I hadn't have fled to Holland, I'd never have learned Dutch. If I'd never have learned Dutch, I'd never have got that job. I'd never have grown a corporate career, and I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. And the gift in the challenge, being able to reframe a challenge with not being able to have kids of our own, is that I'm a bit of a possibility thinker. It's like, okay, well, can we foster? No, that wasn't possible. Can we adopt? No, that wasn't possible. Buckets of love, but just not enough money, which is a little ironic. And so I went down the route of having sponsored kids. So over the years, I've probably had about 9 sponsored children. I've actually only got one at the moment, a little girl called Keat in Cambodia. So I thought, okay, how else can I have kids? So I think, look, my history is no different from anybody else's. It's just that I've had some amazing opportunities to, firstly, I think, develop gratitude, and that was some time I spent in Kenya on a project. We went out there we raised money to build a workshop to house people who teach sewing and plumbing and carpentry and what have you. And I went out there thinking that we were helping them, and it was just a 180-degree turn. I mean, I learned so much from these amazing people. And that was still, I think, back in 2001. That's where I really got the gift of gratitude, the discipline, the practice of gratitude. And again, Toni Powell, who I interviewed, she's a world expert on gratitude. And then the other person I have to thank is, and I couldn't believe he said yes to being on the podcast, is Dr. John Demartini, because I did two, three, four programs with him, and I ended up getting to the point where I could face the person who abused me and have just complete forgiveness and love in a way, to say, okay, well, my life was shaped the way that it was, and I've achieved what I have. Not that I'd want to ever experience anything like that again. Dear God, no. But you can't, you can't change the past, but you can change your perception of it. That's a long answer to a short question.
We went very deep there on that one, Claire, and I applaud you for being so raw and authentic about your responses. And for those that are listening, I'm sure perhaps some people can relate to some of those really difficult and somewhat possibly traumatic times that you've experienced. And I guess on the question, which is around what do you how do you draw on your life experiences to get your message across? There's a lot there that you've just mentioned, and I think what really gleamed out to me was that you just kept thinking it's possible, perhaps, that I can continue to find ways within myself, and that is, in my ways, what the heart and the essence of resilience is, that having that raw and difficult conversation almost within yourself to say, well, what do we do next? How do I get through this? Instead of allowing your mind or your brain to say, well, this isn't my fairy tale dream. It's all come crashing down, and I'm coming crashing down as well. And there's that sort of fight and flight syndrome, I guess, that perhaps we all respond differently to some situations.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, Trent, because it's also about giving ourselves permission to grieve or to be angry or to have that pity party. I know, like Christopher Reeve, when he became, I think he was quadriplegic.
He was my childhood hero growing up.
Oh, was he?
Enough. He was. I still have a Superman ring on my finger, but we won't go there.
I wondered what that ring was. I thought it was to do with rugby. I have seen that ring. Yes, and he said that he would wake up in the morning and have a 20-minute pity party, and he'd scream and he'd shout and he'd cry and he'd say how unfair it all was. So because I've done the deep work, that's not to minimize anything that anybody is going through, and everyone has the right to respond in their own way. And it's interesting, and thank you for bringing this out in me. I don't share a lot of this stuff, even in my resilience programs. Maybe it's something I could start to share more of. But it does, that lived experience, I think, does qualify me to really deeply empathize with people and help identify which of there's so many resilience strategies, but it's about starting small, tiny, tiny, tiny wins, small steps, and identifying which strategies for which people would be the most effective for the place that they're at. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a therapist. And there's really room for professional services. I just, it's just in my heart to help people achieve some of the good things in life that I've
Yeah.
achieved despite the dips.
Yep. One of your listeners has asked, I'd love to hear how you sustain such a positive, upbeat external demeanour through the inevitable ups and downs of life. And we've just covered a couple of those in just this last sort of 5 minutes or so.
I know who that is. That's Sully. That's Bill.
Um,
Thank you for that
it,
question, Bill.
and he also goes on to say it's contagious in a very good way, but I can imagine it's not always easy. And it reminds me of that sort of REM song, Everybody Hurts Sometimes, and we
Oh,
all have to experience hurt and grief in our life. That's just what makes us human. But yeah, Claire, every time I've seen you socially, you've always got this glowing positive persona about yourself. So how do you do what you do?
okay. So the first thing I'd say is ask my husband Jason, because I can be a real grumpy guts. I can, um, but I think I was funny. When I shared before that I was about to start my own company after I left corporate, and the name of the company was Amovita, which is a
Hmm,
very rough translation in Italian of "I love life."
okay.
And I think I do. I I absolutely love life. I love being alive, and I think this together with the gratitude is that when things are not going well, and look, like probably 99% of people who work in as speakers, as facilitators, as trainers, I lost everything during COVID. I lost 100% of my work, and I lost it for 2 years, and I'm starting from scratch, and building back up again. But so it was okay. Well, actually, yeah, it's coming to me now. So um the there's something that we teach in our resilience programs called Control the Controllables, and it's based on Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Is about really sitting down and thinking, okay, right, so the proverbials hit the fan.
Hmm,
What really is within my sphere of influence and control? And it helps to do with this with somebody else, because you can go into victim mode and say, well, nothing's within my sphere of influence and control.
hmm,
And get somebody to challenge you. And so that's when COVID hit, I thought, well, okay, there's force majeure in the contract. I can't do anything about that. But what can I do something about? How can I use my time? And my business partner at the time, Anne, and we wrote a series of blogs called Resilience Bites. And even it's got sort of COVID language in it, but they're still really, really valid today. And that was to find a way to give back. And when you think about it, Trent, we just happen to have been born in very abundant countries. It's just we could have equally been born in in a
yeah,
third world country. So I just, and again, probably from the time in Kenya, I just have that perspective of being so grateful for my health, for the people around me, for where I am in my life and my career, and I've still got a million and one things that I want to do. And sometimes I have to calibrate because I get overly excited about things, and it's like, my God, she's so blooming positive. Will you just calm her down a bit? But yeah, it is who I am. But yes, I do get grumpy too.
yeah. And look, perhaps just as we're obviously having this conversation, perhaps some of what you've experienced, and as you've said, from your past, has shaped you to be, or has shaped you, I'm sure. And you even mentioned that to be who you are today. And perhaps you're looking at some situations now where you're like, and it actually reminds me of that the locus of control, by
Yeah.
Julian Rotter, who talks to the extent of what people believe that how they can control their lives and the external forces. And I do recall someone sitting down with me one time drawing two circles, a small one in the middle and the large one on the
Yeah,
outside. And they said,
yeah,
everything on the outside, that's your external. You can attempt to influence, but you can't control. In
yeah,
the inner circle, that's you. You can decide how you want to wake up in the morning. You can decide how you want to have conversations with your family, your loved ones, your team. You can decide if you're going to go and do some exercise or not, stay in bed or actually do something
yeah.
today. So we actually do have that control. But perhaps some of what you've experienced certainly has shaped you, and you think that, I need to be more upbeat. I want to be more upbeat because I can control that about myself.
It could have been a whole different trajectory, Trent, and I'm grateful that it didn't turn out that way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. As we all are.
Yeah.
We've got another lovely question here. It says, I'd love to hear about trends and themes you have seen this year and what you anticipate may be coming in the foreseeable future.
That's a great question.
It's a broad one.
It is a broad one. I suppose from if we take it from a leadership perspective, I've been lucky enough to either speak at or be a delegate at quite a few conferences this year. Oh my God, it's so good to be back face to face. I loved it.
I
Um,
totally agree.
I think the themes, what's emerging is the whole leading through uncertainty and ambiguity, and that how difficult it is for many leaders because there are no benchmarks. There's nothing from the past to base this on. So our world of work has changed and will forever be different. And I think a lot of leaders are grappling with the whole concept of hybrid. From one end of the continuum is where they just see it as a logistics and how many, what days of the week do people work from home and what days of the week do people come in, through
Mm,
to how do we, how do we use our culture and the way that we lead to attract talent, to make hybrid one of the best experiences we can make. So how do we make the commute worth it for people? What is it that we want them to be experiencing when they come together? And I think it's those leaders who understand that we're social beings, we're tribal in nature, even if we're introverted, that how can we really make this work and invest time into it. So I see that as one of the key challenges or themes this year. Um, Interestingly, I read an article yesterday from Forbes from a fellow speaker, Danielle Dobson, and it's unfortunately it's not good news, and it's that more women leaving the workforce who are in leadership and executive positions. And I knew we were going to have the podcast today, so I actually pulled this quote out from her article, and she said in Australia, just 6% of the ASX 300 CEOs and 26% of executive leadership roles are held by women. Um, Australia is falling behind on measures of gender equality and has dropped from 15th position in 2006, listen to this, to 43rd position in 2022 on the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index. So, these are leakages we absolutely cannot afford to have, and it goes hand in hand with diversity, equity, and inclusion. That this
yeah,
has to be something that is embedded into culture. It's not a tick on the box. It's understanding the challenges that so many women still face in being leaders in the workplace, in understanding things like talent pools. Yvonne and Alex Kelly, who were on our podcast, they have a social enterprise where they find, and I'm one of their career coaches, where they find work for refugees. It's a phenomenally talented pool of resource that we haven't yet tapped into. So I think that there are some huge challenges ahead. I do think we're moving in the right direction, but I don't think we can get complacent. It's funny. Kristen Ferguson, who I follow, she posted something on LinkedIn about the likes of, Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos and Sam, what's his name? Uh, Bankman-Fried from FTX, that, they were leaders where it was, and they're young millennials, where it was all about me. It was all about greed. It was all about power. So we can't rest on our laurels yet, I don't think. I hope that's answered the question.
Yeah, I think it has. And actually kind of segues nicely into this next question is, if you had a magic wand to change the corporate culture, to make
Oh,
some change, what would be your first wish? More CEOs, senior leaders looking at
yeah,
diversity and
yeah.
inclusion,
Um,
perhaps?
actually, Michael Henderson was my last guest, and I was shocked when he told me that the recent statistics, only 8% of leaders of organizations are actively working on their culture, and they're actually leaving, huge amounts of money or abundance, wealth on the table by not doing so, because it can be a strategic asset. But I think if we could picking up, so Michael's an anthropologist, and if you think about the two words corporate culture. So corporate comes from the Latin corpus, which is
Okay.
body. So if I could change anything, I think I'd change it from corporate culture to human culture, that we're dealing with humans. And then also, if you look at the word culture, it's to tend, to nurture, and to grow. So
Mm.
I think if I had my magic wand, it would be getting the message of 21st century leadership across, that what are still considered soft skills are really essential skills. That investment in that investment in people, you can still get a massive shareholder return on value. Look at Atlassian. Look at those companies that really, really do focus on investing in their people, and they're going gangbusters. It's not just their product, it's their culture. So I'd say that, a focus on the culture and how it can be an amazing um, differentiation for you as an organization to attract, grow, and retain your talent, and keep humanizing leadership. And oh yeah, that actually, Sylvia Damiano from the About My Brain Institute, she wrote a brilliant book called Leadership is Upside Down, and she was a podcast guest as well. And she talks about democratizing and distributing leadership, that it's time for us to rethink what we mean about leadership. When you think about, Michael asked me to, he said that we think in schemas, and when I think of leadership, I still think of a pyramid. And it's like, no,
Right.
Claire, no, it's not that the leader is at the top, and we don't need charismatic Elizabeth Holmes of this world. Is to rethink leadership is in every single one of us, every single one of us. And when we embrace our own leadership ability, we don't need that pyramid anymore, or might not.
That's certainly you put a different perspective on it, Claire. You've even got me thinking at this time. So thank you for sharing that. We've got probably one or two more questions, and then I'd love to jump into a little fun, quick fire 60 seconds activity with you, which you haven't been briefed on,
I have no idea what's coming.
and they're above board. So, but we should have a bit of fun with those. So one of your other listeners wanted to ask you, given what you know about using the brain from your change and resilience, and obviously what we've just spoken about now, how would you be able to influence, or what sort of suggestions do you have around influencing, managers from your time in your corporate world? It's a tough one.
The first thing that comes to mind is, you can't change anybody else, but you can change yourself
Yeah.
to adapt to them. I think, yeah, for me, it would be around my levels of self-awareness. But okay, so I know who asked this question. Will, I'll speak to you later. Um, I think if I had my time again and I was able to study then what I studied now, it would be sharing what I'd learned. Certainly for those leaders, the key decisions when I left companies, I left a leader. I didn't leave the organization. I left the leader. Um, and so when I've worked for challenging leaders, it would be again helping them understand that we are tribal in nature and to treat every individual as an individual and really get to know them and understand what makes them tick. I think, and I don't even know if this has got to do with the brain, but certainly if I had my time again, I'd be more assertive. I'd
Mm.
speak up more. So I think certainly, and sharing about psychological safety, about that as a foundation for creating a culture where people can bring their whole selves to work. And I've worked for some brilliant leaders. And when I think about what was it that made them brilliant, they were actually embodying neuro leadership without even knowing that it existed. So they stayed super cool under pressure, with that emotion regulation. Um, they created an environment that sort of helped us um, feel less threatened by challenges, the way that they communicated change. My last boss, Mike, was just absolutely brilliant. When we were going through the redundancies, he did these daily conference calls, and we were a 24/7 call center. So we'd make sure that every shift got to hear them, even if there was no new news. He,
Right.
he, he hyper communicated. He was empathic. So yeah, I think and actually there's, one of the bosses who was, he often took credit for, I did all the I did I did all the hard work and then he took credit for it. I met him a few years after I'd then moved to another company, and he invited me to go sailing. He was a passionate sailor, and we did a round the Isle of Wight yacht race. And in the evening, he shared with me he was totally out of his depth. And that just reframed everything for me. So, I know it sounds a bit soppy, but sometimes difficult leaders, there are reasons why they're difficult, or if we seek first to understand, then that might help how we deal with them. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a bit of a roundabout roundabout answer. I'll
That's all
get you,
right.
Will.
And just one final question, and I guess kind of really brings it all together. This is why the focus on the brain, and does it really make a difference?
Hmm. Okay. Yes. 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 So, as I said, as I started learning, I did a diploma in the neuroscience of leadership, and then in 2018 I did an advanced diploma. That what I realized was a lot of the people I work with, they're super strong. Their strengths are in their analysis. They're rational. They're logical, and to be able to offer something that's evidence based, rather than just a hypothesis. Um, what I realized, I was working with a large utility company in Queensland and doing a lot of programs that were the neuroscience based around change and resilience. And you could see these light bulbs of understanding going on when I was explaining some of the basic areas of networks of the brain related to change, related to what we call threat and reward, related to building resilience. And actually, I was running a workshop on the Sunshine Coast, and one of the previous people in my program, one of the leaders, walked past. It was on lunch break, and he came in to see me. He said, "Oh, have you got 5 minutes? I've been meaning to get in touch with you." I said, "Yeah, sure." And he was head of workplace health and safety, and this was a utility company had to be extremely safety conscious,
Right.
and he was really, really struggling with his people, um, because they saw him as a bit of a Pied Piper of a leader, and he was disliked. And he just said, "I just want to say thank you, Claire." He said, "My relationship with my people has changed. My relationship with my wife has changed. And above all, my relationship with my 5-year-old son has changed." So the answer is yes, yes, yes.
Right. And absolutely. I think of some of the things that I've experienced and how learning from others has shaped my thinking over time as well. Whereas, obviously, as I've gone through life experiences, I've taken the good and I've pushed aside the ones that I prefer not to remember. But I always sort of think about at times when I need to draw on those less favourable experiences to just kind of stop and think and gather my thinking and be less reactive on emotion. Whereas previously I was quite an emotive person, I'd react straight away. But I've certainly learned within myself to sort of bring things back into some context at time, and even just taking time to think about my response to certain
Mm.
situations, as opposed to reacting on the spot. So
Yep, we have the power of veto. We have 0.2 seconds to change from reacting to responding.
we're going to now segue into our quick fire, which is going
Okay.
to be reacting and responding in 60 seconds here, Claire. And look, these are just going to be some fun questions.
Okay.
So I'm just going to ask you some questions, and I'd love you just to respond with the first thought that comes to mind. So
Yeah.
no need to think too hard about them, but
Okay.
hopefully your listeners can learn a little bit more about you in this time. All right, starting the clock now. Do you naturally gravitate towards tea or coffee in the morning?
Lemon and hot water, then tea, then coffee.
Wow. Playing sport or watching sport or neither?
One of the reasons Jason married me was because I like watching sport, and I love dancing and playing tennis.
Wonderful. Holiday preference, would it be to relax by the pool or do you seek out adventure?
Adventure, adventure, adventure.
When do you feel most productive in the day?
Between 6 and 10 in the morning, and between sort of 4 and 7 in the evening. Lunchtime's okay, but 2 to 4 is bleh.
Right, more that European siesta comes into it then,
Yeah.
perhaps. Any specific shows you are currently watching that you would recommend?
Not at the moment. No, I'm looking for a good one.
Okay, maybe some of your listeners can
Yeah.
send some suggestions through. What book are you currently reading?
Oh, I can finally say a fiction book. The Island by Victoria Hislop. It's about Spinalonga, which is an island in Greece. It's a novel. It was a leper colony, and Social by Matthew Lieberman, because I'm writing a white paper on a model I've developed.
Okay, sounds fascinating on that one. What's your favourite time of year?
When I lived in the UK, autumn. Just love it. The seasons aren't quite as defined here, but still, yeah. When the heat of summer's gone, and the cool crispness and the clear sunrises, so still autumn, even though it's not as pronounced.
Okay. What's one piece of advice you would go back and tell your younger self? Now, I know there could be a lot with that one, but
Yeah.
is there
No.
just one?
Trust and things will work out. My mum used to say, "What's for you, will ne'er go past you. What's meant for you is meant for you."
Wonderful. What's the most bizarre thing you've ever eaten?
Oh, probably when I was in Holland and the chef gave me koolsvlees. I can't calf glands. The glands from the neck of a calf. It's all right. I've been vegetarian since 1990.
Right, that might have been the reason you chose to be vegetarian, and I don't blame you. If you had a time machine, would you go forward or back in time?
Oh gosh. When I was younger, I'd always want to go forward, but I think I'd go back. But how far back? Oh my goodness, I don't know. I think I'd maybe go back and see if I could interview Jesus and what all the, I'm sure he was an amazing person, but I'd like to verify it.
Okay. If you were shipwrecked on an island, so think Castaway the movie, would
Yeah,
you seek to build shelter first or search for food first?
shelter.
Okay. Who is your inspiration? So think professionally that you follow. And I know you've got a few, but is there one that sort of stands out?
Oh, I mean, I love Mike Cannon-Brookes, the CEO of Atlassian. I think he's changing the world, and the Dalai Lama.
Okay. If you could delete one of your social media accounts, so think Twitter or LinkedIn, which one would it be?
Oh, definitely Twitter now.
Okay. Thought you might say that. And lastly, if you weren't producing your podcasts or involved in professional speaking and obviously delivering your professional development programs with BrainSmart, what might you be doing, Claire?
I'd be fostering injured joeys, kangaroos, wombats, possums. I'd be adopting donkeys, but there's not too many of them in Australia.
Depends if we're talking about the animal ones or not.
Oh, they were great questions. Thank you, Trent.
My pleasure, Claire. It's been an absolute pleasure to spend the last hour or so with you and just getting to know you on different levels. For those who are listening, I do know Claire. I've known Claire for quite a few years, so it's been a real pleasure and an honour to be on your podcast, Claire. Look forward to hearing many more of these in the future. This one being number 30, which is a real achievement. So. Thank you very much, and thank you to your listeners for listening.
And thank you, Trent. I know from the way that you've opened the questions, you've been doing research, and I was like, no, don't worry, don't worry, it's okay, it's all right, and changing the questions around and making it really spontaneous for me. And I am so grateful, and I just felt really safe with you to be able to be raw, authentic, even though we know each other, but we don't know, I'm sure a lot of the stuff that came out you didn't know. So thank you.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, a real pleasure. Maybe we'll do a part 2 at the end of next year. We keep this going.
Bye now. Thanks for listening, and we hope that this conversation provided the insights and inspiration that you were looking for. Did you know that Authentic Leadership is currently ranking 6th in the top 25 Australian leadership podcasts? You can help us get to number 1 by heading over to Apple iTunes and doing 3 quick things. 1, subscribing. 2, giving us a positive rating. And 3, writing a short review. This is the most effective way for us to get the key messages around 21st century leadership out into the community. And before you go, if you're in the business of learning and development or HR and are looking for a facilitator or speaker, let's talk. You can head over to the BrainSmart website, that's brain-smart.com, to see examples of our programs, or email me, Clare, that's CLARE, at brain-smart.com. Go well, and thanks for listening.